So if I were you, I'd throw the government to the curb and place your faith in something bigger and something more permanent, because the government is not as squeaky clean as we might want to suggest. And we'll look at that in our next story as we look at the Biden administration, who just recently, without any act of legislative authority, began overturning laws with guns. Here's how this works. The Biden administration on Thursday proposed the broadest expansion of firearm background checks in decades, leveraging a provision of the bipartisan gun control law passed last year that requires thousands of unlicensed firearm brokers to register as federally licensed dealers. The regulations drafted by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and Explosives are intended to close loopholes involving gun shows and internet sales. They are part of President Biden's piecemeal efforts to enact a key policy goal: universal background checks, which has been repeatedly stymied by congressional Republicans. Federal law requires background checks only for purchases made through the about 80,000 firearm sellers who are engaged in the business of selling, shipping, importing, or manufacturing weapons. But unlicensed private sellers in many states have been able to legally sell at gun shows out of their houses and through online platforms without having to submit to the criminal and mental health background check required for the tens of thousands of gun sellers regulated by the government. The proposed rules are intended to close the gap between state and federal law by requiring anyone who earns a profit from selling firearms to obtain a federal license and conduct a background check. Now, upon first hearing that, some of you who have never practiced your Second Amendment right or believed in it, maybe you just hate the Constitution, or maybe you listen to the left and you believe that there are certain fundamental rights in the Constitution, like aborting your baby, but having a gun, which is explicitly stated in the Second Amendment, is not one of those rights. But nonetheless, maybe if you hear that, you're thinking to yourself, well, what's the big deal with background checks? I mean, shouldn't everybody who owns a gun potentially have to undergo a background check? And I'm going to potentially make both sides of the argument angry here. And I would say I have no problem with everybody who has a firearm going through a background check. But now, because of Joe Biden, his administration, in other words, the federal government, is bypassing all of that and from above pressing down a law upon an individual that before wasn't in place and wasn't on the books. And again, all of this without going through the Senate, without going through the House, with zero legislative process, simply through a definitional change. So in other words, here's the problem with this, and something that all of you, whether you're Second Amendment right practitioners or not, you should have a problem with, is that once again, this administration is showing that they have no problem weaponizing bureaucracies and weaponizing the Department of Justice or the ATF or any other of its branches. They have no problem weaponizing these people against the individual citizen. Now, that's a huge problem. It sets a precedent. And yes, this is a slippery slope argument, and it's a small one because this one isn't as big a deal to me, and it may be to you, but it isn't to me as some of the other things that we're seeing right now in front of our face. For instance, the First Amendment is being hijacked by the Biden administration online through the FBI, calling places like Twitter and Facebook and asking them to suppress stories. We've already seen this over and over and over again. And here we have the Biden administration again backdooring legislation through the suppression of the Second Amendment by definitional changes as to what constitutes an individual seller and what constitutes an actual, brick and mortar seller or a person who has a business. All of this shows us that Biden has absolutely no problem usurping authority in illegitimate ways and weaponizing the DOJ against its citizens. Now, this is a precedent that is incredibly damaging. It's a usurpation of power that uses language games, and the left is great at it. In fact, they can't even define what a woman is, famously. They love using language games to twist and manipulate things. I mean, I would love to see the analog for the right on this, and I'm trying to be bipartisan here. I would love to see the way in which the right manipulates language in order to force bureaucracies down the throat of individual private citizens. This is something only the left does. And this is something that is so brazen that if you don't pay attention to it, it could create a precedent that not only in the future has problems, but a precedent that we've seen in the past. So my problem is, yes, the future precedent of usurping power that doesn't belong to the federal government. suppressing state laws and the federal government ultimately just overstretching its authority. But we've seen this in the past. So we don't even have to use slippery slope arguments. We can, about what may happen in the future, we can look to the past and see that the Second Amendment was a lightning rod of controversy throughout history. Now, of course, not the Second Amendment as it's situated in the present, but simply the idea of private gun ownership, something that from the foundings of America was essential to the livelihood of the individual, and something that I would say is essential still to this day. But all you have to do is go to the famous example on the left, which is Nazi Germany. Because I'll bet you'll never guess what happened with Second Amendment rights. Now, of course, the Second Amendment's ours, but I'm talking about gun protections. I'll bet you'll never guess what happened when the Third Reich gained control and started to impose some of their ideas on gun legislation. Well, I bet you'd never guess that those who are a part of the Nazi Party experienced a leniency as far as guns were concerned, that those citizens in the Third Reich all of a sudden experienced much more freedoms as it was, as it pertained to them with guns. But I bet you'll never guess that those who were outside the Nazi Party, that much more restrictive gun laws were imposed upon them. Sound like maybe the left trying to impose its ideas about guns on the right? And I bet you'll never guess that, more broadly, that Jews in the Third Reich, in Nazi Germany, were totally prohibited from gun ownership, from personal gun ownership. Now, why is that? Because the limitation of gun ownership and the restrictions of gun ownership has always been an earmark of totalitarianism. You may think that's overbloated because we've got a federal government that has tanks and bombers and aircraft carriers, and what does a private citizen have if the government decides to go rebellious on us? What does a private citizen have that can actually protect themselves? But I just want you, for just a moment, to think about the historical implications of gun ownership and how totalitarians have throughout history used gun ownership as a canary in the coal mine, as it were, as to the impending nature of totalitarianism in the future. Whether you think it's ridiculous to think that a private citizen can protect himself against the government going rogue or not, what I want you to at least acknowledge is the fact that totalitarian states have had huge problems with the Second Amendment. And if we find that the Second Amendment is in the crosshairs of a particular party, then you might want to question the totalitarian tendencies of that party. And more importantly, throughout this show, I've tried to illustrate the problem with secularism. If the government does go corrupt and you've placed all of your faith and hope in a system of government that ultimately is just corruptible and made by man, then we might need to put our faith in something much bigger than ourselves and in the federal government, which, by the way, is just run by human beings.
So you just got done watching a small excerpt of a much larger episode. You can find the link to that full episode down below in the description of this video, so you definitely want to check that out, because if you like that clip, you'll like the much larger episode. And while you're at it, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and click that little bell to be notified when great new episodes of Indie Thinker come your way. Thanks for watching.